Hello students, it's Mr. Brissett here. I was really hoping we'd be back in our classrooms for this final unit of the year. It's my favorite unit to teach, but we're not, so next best thing, we're going to do this online. And so this unit is on the Renaissance, and I call it the rebirth of civilization. That statue you're looking at there, some of you might recognize it. It's the David by Michelangelo, and it plays an important role in the history of the Renaissance. It's also a really amazing statue. When I take people to Europe, we go see that in Florence, and it's massive, way bigger than life size, and hyper realistic. Anyway, more on that later. The presentation I'm doing today is going to have a quiz at the end, and you are free to do the quiz while you're watching the presentation. It's up to you. The quiz obviously is going to be on Teams, and this presentation I'm just going to put on YouTube, so that's where you're watching it right now. And so, without further ado, let me get into Renaissance, the rebirth of civilization. First, let's recap the history of Western civilization, something I've been talking to you guys since the start of the year about. So there's three main periods or eras in the history of the Western world. There's the ancient world, and that's places like Mesopotamia, Egypt, Greece, and of course Rome. And those great civilizations, though they were imperfect and brutal in many ways by modern standards, helped the progression of human beings by encouraging and funding art, architecture, science, engineering, and education. In the past, each empire would be swallowed up by a new, more powerful, innovative empire. But as we learned way back in September, when the Roman Empire collapsed in Western Europe, there wasn't this grand civilization that took its place. Fast forwarding from the collapse of Rome and the Dark Ages, in the midst of the Middle Ages, an Italian writer named Petrarch proposed the idea that after the fall of Rome, for the first time in human history, human progress slowed or stopped, or in some cases even reversed. So he's the first one to kind of write about that idea. People living during the times that they live in don't always have the ability to reflect on the past and how the present compares with the past, but that's what he did. He read a lot about ancient civilizations, and he realized that the civilization he was living in Italy in the 1300s, was not as advanced as past civilizations from more than 1,000 years before. Fast forward another 100 years, by the 1440s, Petrarch's idea was a commonly held belief, and the Italian historian Leonardo Bruni proposed that history can be divided into three parts: ancient, middle, and modern. He created the term media tempestus, which is Middle Ages. And so it was really this guy, Leonardo Bruni, who invented the idea that there was this middle age between the ancient world and the modern world. And Leonardo Bruni in the 1440s in Italy considered himself to be somebody living in the modern world. So in the 1400s, Europeans, especially in the city-states of Italy, and most especially in Florence, which was the most powerful city-state in Italy at that time, started to look back at the ruins of the ancient Romans and Greeks and imagine a future which embraced the progress of the ancient people. So that picture there, that's the Pantheon in Rome. And this is the most intact building from the ancient world. and it's an architectural masterpiece. The way that they built the massive dome that you see in the top was a mystery to people in the Middle Ages, because it was built using this material called concrete. And during the chaos that came after the fall of the Roman Empire, during that time where there was very little literacy and education, the way to make cement, which is what hardens into concrete, was lost. They lost it. So they went backwards. They didn't know how to do it. But here in Rome, they could go look at this and see in the past their ancestors had progressed further than they were at the current time. So this was an inspiration to them. This is a picture I took on our last trip to Europe in 2019. And that's the front of the Pantheon. The big dome is behind this massive facade at the front. And you can see by the size of the people down near the pillars there, this is a huge building. The Pantheon was actually built by the Romans almost 2,000 years ago as a temple right in the big city of Rome, right in the center, of the big city of Rome. A temple to all the gods. Pan means all, theon is gods. And so they had statues of all the different gods in the Roman religion in there. And then when the Roman Empire Christianized in the 300s, they knocked down temples all over the place and built churches. But here they said, well, we're not going to knock this down. So they just took out all the pagan statues and they put a cross in it and they said, it's a church now. And so this is one of actually the oldest churches in the world. It's been a church for 1,700 years, and people still go to church services there and have weddings there and stuff in this ancient building. So the modern era that Leonardo Bruni was talking about was this break from the Middle Ages. He realized, and people at that same time in the 1400s, especially in Florence, realized that something had changed, and they were in the midst of the change. And we call that change today the Renaissance, which in French means the rebirth. The Renaissance was characterized by an explosion of new ideas in all fields of human endeavor. Renaissance people were not smarter than their medieval ancestors. They were just born in a time that allowed them to pursue their interests, at a time where education was becoming valued again. And you see a picture there, it's a self-portrait of one of the most famous people of the Renaissance, and that's Leonardo da Vinci. And he spent a lot of his life in Italy, especially in Florence, and had a huge influence on people around him as the Renaissance was getting underway. So I said that the Renaissance was an explosion of new ideas in all fields of human endeavor. So we're going to look at some of those fields. So one of them is philosophy. Philosophy is, it's actually, to me, it's kind of hard to define. Philosophy is really thinking and discussing and debating ideas like the purpose of life, what's right and what's wrong. And that's philosophy. And during the Renaissance, new ideas that human beings were capable of great achievements and that the greatest gift humans have is free will emerged. During the Middle Ages, they did not have this idea that humans were so capable of great things and that free will was an important thing. Free will is just the idea that we choose our own fates by our own actions. In the Middle Ages, people were fatalistic. That means that they believed that everything was already set. Everything was written down in some book before they were even born, and they had no real control over what happened to them in their lives. That's fatalistic. They're just doomed to their fate, whatever it may be. And if their fate is that they are born into a wealthy family and have a cushy, awesome life, hey, great. If their fate is that they're born into a peasant family and live through terrible famines, and well, that's just your fate and you can't do anything about it. That's medieval thinking. In the Renaissance, they started to think in a different way, in a more positive way, I would say. And so these ideas, we call them humanism. The ideals of humanism shaped all the other changes that the Renaissance brought. That illustration there is a famous one from one of Leonardo da Vinci's many notebooks and sketchbooks and stuff. And it's just showing a man and showing kind of some geometry as it relates to the human form. But it's that human form, that the idea that humans are important, of the utmost importance, that kind of shaped the rest of the Renaissance. Another field of human endeavor is politics. So politics is really who leads and how do they lead and how do the followers follow. That's the way I look at it. Though it would take a while, the seeds of democracy were sown with the ideals of humanism. So that idea that humans have free will, that you choose your fate, and they have the right to choose for themselves, this started moving into the field of politics. Politics up to this point in most of Europe was based on basically people being born into a position of power. I become the Duke because my dad was the Duke and I'm his oldest son. I become the king because my dad was the king and I'm the oldest son. And that idea started to fall by the wayside as people started to think, wait a minute, why are we just allowing these people to rule over us? Don't we have free will? If there's anything the Renaissance is known for, it's art. During the Renaissance, art became more precise and more realistic, and also because of humanism, more focused on the innate beauty of human beings. And of course, what we're looking at here on the left is just a part of the Bayeux Tapestry from 1066, and then on the right, very famous painting by Leonardo da Vinci called the Mona Lisa. There's a little bit of mystery about this painting. Who is this, and what's she smiling about, or is she smiling? A lot of the artistically, a lot of the notoriety about this painting comes from the expression on her face and actually the background as well. You see that she is positioned sitting someplace with the background receding into the distance. And this is something medieval artists couldn't do. They couldn't make something look realistic. I guarantee you that if there was a photograph of this woman, and historians mostly think it's just the wife of a wealthy merchant in Italy, and that merchant either didn't pay Da Vinci for the painting, like he was going to have this portrait of his wife done, and then in the end he said, I don't have enough money to pay you, and so Da Vinci just kept it. Or Da Vinci just kept it because when he finished it, he's like, this is really good. I'm not just going to give it to this guy to hang in his living room. But anyway, we're not really sure about that. But the thing is, the painting is a woman. It's not, there's no religious connotation to it. This isn't the Virgin Mary or something, who's a topic of many paintings and stuff from the Middle Ages and the Renaissance too. It's just a portrait of a person, and it's showing the person is in the foreground. The background recedes into the distance, and the person is the important thing in the painting, and that's part of the spirit of humanism. This famous painting, The Birth of Venus by Sandro Botticelli, caused quite a stir when it was first revealed in Florence, and that's because of the nudity. During the Renaissance, the humanism of the Renaissance told people that they didn't need to be ashamed of themselves, and that their body was a gift given to them, and they should be proud of it. And so artists started making nude sculptures. The David is fully nude, the sculpture I showed you at the start, but that was only from the chest up. And paintings like this have some nudity in them, and it was shocking to a lot of people at that time. But eventually it became fairly normal, and in art, people in Florence weren't walking around naked. They, that wasn't normal. But just to portray the human form in its beauty was becoming the style, and that also reflects the ideals of humanism. It's interesting to note that during the Middle Ages, it was considered sinful to own a mirror. So, you shouldn't be looking at yourself. You shouldn't be vain. And during the Renaissance, people loved mirrors. They were extremely expensive, but people started putting mirrors in their houses so they could look at themselves and make sure their hair looked okay before they went out for the day or whatever. But it was definitely a different time, and the art reflects that change in the values of the people in Italy and then the rest of Europe as the Renaissance started to spread. Architecture went through an enormous amount of change during the Renaissance, and the architecture really, it also reflected the values of the people. And we'll figure that out during the unit. That might be hard to conceive how buildings would reflect the values of the people. But if you look at the one on the left, that's a Gothic cathedral. That's the St. Vitus Cathedral in Prague. And there are Gothic churches all over Europe. And that's from the Middle Ages, so the pre-Renaissance era. And Gothic was actually an insult that Renaissance architects used to, they called it Gothic. The Goths, of course, were one of the tribes, the barbarian tribes that overran the ancient civilization of Rome. And so, they named it Gothic as an insult because they wanted to build something new and better and not build in the old style. Personally, I love the Gothic style. I mean, look at that giant cathedral, massive stone walls and huge stained glass windows and gargoyles and statues, and it's I think it's fantastic. But in the Renaissance they wanted something different, and what they did, just like they were doing with some other endeavors, was they started looking back to the ancient world, and they looked at what were mostly ruins from the ancient Greek and Roman civilizations. And so the little temple on the right, Tempietto di San Pietro, was kind of like an architectural experiment near the start of the Renaissance. They just thought, this one architect thought, I want to try and build something that looks like maybe a building that would have existed, 1,500 years ago in Greece or something. So they needed, for that style, there's a lot of stairs and columns and, importantly, domes. And during the Middle Ages, the ability to make a dome, a big dome over a building, had been lost. In the ancient world, they had lots of domed buildings, and of course the Pantheon is the most famous one and the only one that's intact from the ancient world. But they didn't have the engineering to do it anymore. Until a guy named Filippo Brunelleschi came along. Now, this is the skyline of Florence, and the giant dome on the right is part of a much larger building, which is the cathedral. The main cathedral of Florence is a huge building. And when they built this wealthy family that kind of ran Florence, called the Medici family, they said, well, we're going to have the biggest church in the world, because Florence was super rich and they wanted to show off that they were rich and to celebrate their faith. And so they said, we're going to build the biggest church in the world, and it's going to have a giant dome on it. And everyone was really excited. And, okay, yeah, that's going to be fantastic. And they started building it. And then they started asking, well, how are we going to build the dome? And the architects, the engineers said, we don't know. We have no idea. We know how to build the base of the church, but we don't know how to build a dome. And for 100 years, that building sat with a giant gaping hole in the roof, couldn't be consecrated as a church. Rain poured in right where the altar is. They just had this shell of a building with no roof on it. But that was the confidence of the age. They just knew that somebody would come along and figure out how to build a dome. So they said, well, let's start building the building and somebody will figure it out. Now, it took longer than they thought, but this guy Brunelleschi, kind of a mad genius. I'm going to show you a film about him. He had a really interesting life, but he told the Medicis, he said, I can build a dome. And they were skeptical because he seemed kind of crazy. Anyway, they funded a trip for him to go down to Rome to investigate the dome over the Pantheon. And Brunelleschi went down there and spent some time there taking measurements, making drawings, and he came back with an idea for building this gigantic dome. And it took him 13 years, him and obviously a crew of workers, 13 years, highly dangerous work to build that freestanding dome. There's nothing holding it up except for itself. And you'll see if you came to Europe with me, you'll go up into the dome itself and see the inner workings of how that thing was built. And then you get to go out on the roof over top of the dome and get this massive view over the city of Florence. And anyway, that was a grand achievement and one of the real symbols of the new forward movement progression that was happening during the Renaissance. And pretty much, if you think of any domed building in the world today, like the Capitol building in Washington, D.C., for example, that's a pretty famous one. These domes, they all owe their existence basically to this Renaissance genius, Brunelleschi, who figured out how to build domes after the engineering and information about them had been lost for so long. Science underwent many changes during the Renaissance. In the Middle Ages, science wasn't really a vocation. Like you didn't really have people who would consider themselves scientists, not in the modern sense of the word anyway. Most questions that you wanted to have answered about the natural world you just asked the church. They were the source of all information. But during the Renaissance, universities started popping up. I mean, they had universities in the Middle Ages too, but more and more started popping up, and the disciplines relating to the natural world, like biology, like physics, like astronomy, started to become very popular. People were interested to understand the world, and so they started investigating the world through hands-on procedures, not just asking the church authorities why this happens, or like when they'd have plagues and stuff, they'd just ask the church, well, why'd this happen? The church didn't know. They came up with theories and stuff, but it wasn't until the Renaissance that we started to have the scientific method, where they would actually do experiments and try and figure out actual facts about these phenomena in the natural world. And this caused, of course, conflict between the scientific and church communities. The guy pictured there was one of the most famous almost victims of that conflict. His name's Galileo, and he was a very brilliant astronomer and physicist. He did all sorts of experiments. Famously, he did experiments with gravity off of the Leaning Tower of Pisa. But he invented a really powerful telescope. And with his telescope and his knowledge of physics and mathematics, he was able to ascertained that the Earth was not a stationary object, was in fact hurtling through space in an orbit around the sun. Now, doesn't sound, I mean, we just kind of take that for granted. We all know that. And there's the Earth there in this drawing, 3 away from the sun, the 3rd from the sun. But back then, when he published his paper stating that, this was a massive controversy because, like I said before, everyone just used to ask the church questions like this, and the church had already published their theory, their idea that the Earth was actually stationary and was in the center of the universe, and everything else moved around the Earth. And this, I mean, part of the reason for that, they said the Earth is the most important of all the heavenly bodies. It's the place that God sent his only son to, and it was just to it was just their idea. They didn't know, but people always asked them these questions, so they came up with ideas. Well, now this guy has another idea that contradicts it, and in fact his isn't just an idea, it's a fact. And so the church was not happy about this. It's a big institution. It's hard for big institutions to change, and they certainly didn't like this scientist contradicting what they had been teaching for a long time. So Galileo was actually put on trial for heresy, and the penalty for that could be death. Of course, they had lots of death sentences back then in the Renaissance era. So when he was put on trial, eventually he relented and just said to the church, okay, you're right. But he always knew. If he famously, they say he whispered under his breath, but still it moves, meaning the Earth is actually moving. And anyway, so that's some of the stuff we're going to learn about science. We're going to learn other things too, but it's that conflict between the old ideas that were centered mostly on church teachings, not on the Bible necessarily, but just on church teachings, and new ideas that were coming out based on people using the scientific method to test things out. The last one I want to talk about, the last element or a human endeavor that underwent major changes, is religion. During the age of humanism. And humanism, you have to understand, was not an anti-religious movement at all. The great humanists of the Renaissance, which is basically all like people like Da Vinci and Michelangelo and etc., they were all religious people, but they just saw that they just believed that human beings were created by God and just had this innate power and ingenuity and beauty that just wasn't celebrated during the more fatalistic Middle Ages. So here comes this guy in the picture there. His name's Martin Luther, and he's a German born very religious person. He ends up as a young man entering the priesthood, and he becomes a monk. And he actually even did a pilgrimage. He walked all the way from Germany across the Alps all the way down to Rome. That's a long journey. But he wanted to visit the sacred holy sites of Rome, see the place where St. Peter, that's where St. Peter's Basilica is, was martyred, and he loved his faith and was a very devout Catholic. As he got older, though, during this age of humanism and free will, he started to question some of the teachings of the church, and he came to the conclusion that people should read the Bible themselves. And up to this point, the Bible was only really published in Latin. Mass was said in Latin. Only the priests knew Latin. It wasn't a language that people use. Like if you're in Germany or England or Spain or Poland, church services are in Latin. The Bible's in Latin, so you can't even read it yourself. And so he said, no, the Bible should be in the vernacular, in the language of the people, and so should the services in the church. That was one of the things that he suggested. Another one, he wanted to... he was a priest, and so he had to be celibate. He wasn't allowed to marry. Well, he had met this young woman who actually was a nun. They're also not allowed to marry. And they, at a distance, fell in love with each other. And he was like, so he didn't want... The priest, that would happen sometimes, and then the priest would just leave the priesthood and get married. But he's like, I love being a priest. I don't want to leave the priesthood. So he made a list of 95, they call it the 95 Theses, the 95 complaints, I guess you'd say, against some of the teachings of the church. And he posted them up on a door on the church in Wittenberg, in a town he lived in Germany. And this was a place where people would post up all sorts of information and stuff, and scholars from the university would come and read it and debate it and stuff. And it was before like Snapchat or whatever. And so people would debate these things. Well, these things that he put up on the board, the complaints against the church, this was dangerous to complain against the church. And Martin Luther said some things that upset the church, the hierarchy of the church and the Pope very much. So he was kind of a wanted man. He went on the run a bit, but because of another invention that came from the ingenuity, the science of the Renaissance called the printing press, he was able to disseminate his ideas to a lot of people very quickly. And we ended up in Europe with a schism in the church. So for the vast majority of the history of Christianity, there was only really one church in Europe, and that was the Roman Catholic Church. And now Martin Luther breaks away from the church and marries the nun. She also breaks away from the church, but he still, like I said, wants to be a priest. So he starts his own church, and that's what we call that the Lutheran Church. And that's really the first Protestant church. And soon, because the Bible's open to interpretation, it's the age of humanism, other churches start popping up. Calvinist, Anabaptist, which is Baptist today, Presbyterian, all these Protestant churches are a direct result of the humanism and the desire to use our free will that came about during the Renaissance. So that's the end of my introduction to the Renaissance. I'm going to create a simple little quiz for you guys to do on in the assignments. You'll see it pop up there, and you're allowed to, go back in the video and look back and listen to what I was saying as you do the quizzes. Don't worry about it's not like you have to just have listened to this video and then do the quiz without looking back. Go ahead and look back if you want to. I'm fine with that. I just want you guys to learn about this stuff, and I hope you will enjoy this unit. I really do enjoy teaching it, and I really, as I said at the start, wish we were just in class learning it what I'll call the proper way, but this is what we have to do for now. So the video is now over.